gotta get yours, I gotta get mine. You gotta get yours, I gotta get mine. You gotta get yours, I gotta get mine.
Welcome to the Big and Tall Sports Podcast with your hosts, Pete Apostolopoulos and Alec Reid.
I gotta get mine, you gotta get yours, I gotta get mine. Your block, get yours. I keep my mind on my money, money on my mind. Finger on the trigger, hand on my nine. I'm smoking blunts and skunk, putting holes and pumps and only.
And what's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of the Big and Tall Sports Pod. Pete and Alec here with you as always. Episode number 3. Who we got today, Alec?
We have, in honor of him being inducted to the Basketball Hall of Fame, we have Allen Iverson, the answer.
We talking about practice, not a game. We talking about practice, not a game, not the game that I go out there and die for and play every game like it's my last. Not the game. We talking about practice, man.
Yeah, Allen Iverson, one of my favorite players to watch. Really could have done a lot more in the league if he wasn't such a interesting character off the court, but yeah, definitely one of the best ball handlers in the history of the NBA, and really a great guy to watch. So today on the pod, we have a very interesting day. We're going to be talking some hockey today, and who's coming in today, Alec?
We have a very special guest, 18-year NHL veteran, 2-time Stanley Cup winner from Etobicoke, Ontario, Dave Reid. And yes, he is my dad.
So we have Dave coming in the second half. So I guess let's just get right into it here. A lot of hockey going on now with baseball done. You know, we have the NFL, but being Canadians and living in Canada, it's pretty much been hockey ever since the World Series has been done. And, you know, I have to admit, I'm kind of enjoying it now. It's a good little break. I mean, I lived in the States, and when I went to school there, I really realized how much I enjoy watching and reading about and following it. I mean, it's something that I really gained a lot of appreciation for when I went away. And I think that this season has definitely had a lot of headlines that haven't necessarily been talked about because of the baseball. So let's get right into it. What do we got going on first? What are we going to talk about first?
Well, it's an exciting time for hockey, and especially with the young Leafs that we have and a lot of exciting young talent. But I want to start even before this hockey season started and before the summer, during the summer, with the World Cup of Hockey. And we talk about these young players, McDavid and Austin Matthews and guys like Eichel and Mitch Marner. But how good did Team North America look this summer? How exciting were they to watch during the World Cup of Hockey?
I think that at the beginning of the tournament, I thought it was a huge gimmick. And I was like, what are these guys going to show up and they're going to get slammed every game? And a lot of them have never played together before. And then they show up on the scene, and by the end of the tournament, they're my favorite team to watch.
I agree. I think that they brought an excitement to the tournament and really brought this energy and the new style of hockey that we're not used to seeing. And the skill level is just absolutely unparalleled.
And I think the way that team plays is indicative of the way that the NHL is kind of trajecting. Is that a word?
Projecting,
thank you. How the NHL...
trajectory that it's on, the path it's on.
Thank you, smartass. But yeah, the way the NHL is growing, and with all these young players, you know, there are guys, Connor McDavid's 2 years younger than we are. Right?
That's scary.
Like, how ridiculous is that? You know, you have the 3 Leaf guys, Matthews, Marner, and Nylander. Austin Matthews right now leading the league in points, or he's second in the league in points. Leading the Eastern Conference, I believe. Artem Anisimov is leading the league.
And I think that's what's exciting about hockey right now. You look at the Team North America, and you talk about just absolute skill, and that's what was exciting about the World Cup of Hockey was just we got this new brand of skill and this new excitement to international hockey, and we got to see these guys from Team Europe. Guys like Anze Kopitar, Matt Zuccarello from Norway, who otherwise wouldn't get to play in this tournament. And, you know, Frederik Andersen from Denmark, guys that aren't from these big countries that normally wouldn't get to play in these tournaments, kind of branding together. So, Pete, are you more impressed with Team North America and the skill that they put on, or the veteran guys from Team Europe bonding together and making it to the finals?
I think that if you looked at the Team Europe roster before the tournament started, a lot of people were probably thinking, it'll be interesting, but I think they're going to get smoked. And that's what I thought, and I'm pretty sure that's what you thought, and that's what a lot of other people thought. And looking at Team North America, the stigma was, well, they're going to be entertaining, but they're not going to win any games. And I think both things were proven wrong. Both teams excelled, with Team Europe obviously going to the finals, and then Team North America was everyone's favorite team by the end of the tournament. And so I think that although critics were pretty heavy on the tournament, I think from that aspect, the NHL got it right. I mean, a lot of people were questioning having these two teams in it from the start. And by the end of the tournament, aside from the Canadians, they're probably the two teams that everyone was rooting for.
Did everything not play out like it should have, though, other than maybe Team USA? And I want to talk about them in a second. But is there a problem that Team Canada won in such a dominant fashion again? Because we had so many years where it was Russia, Canada, the United States, but Team Canada is kind of pulling away with the talent that they have. And you throw these guys that we're talking about on Team North America, guys like McDavid, and you talked about a lot of these other young guys, Mitch Marner, some of these guys. When they come up and join this Team Canada team, is there anyone that can realistically slow them down going forward in this tournament?
So we have a list in front of us right now of exciting young players that we highlighted. And you have Mark Scheifele, you have Nathan McKinnon, you have Connor McDavid, Aaron Ekblad, Mitch Marner. Out of the 10 names, 5 of the guys are Canadian.
Austin Matthews, too.
Austin Matthews, American.
Right. Cut that out.
So, I mean, what else would you expect? Canada could put 3 teams in it, and they would be expected to come first, second, and third in an interchangeable order. Like, there's just so much depth in this country that international competitions are getting pretty ridiculous. Like, and the only thing I can think of is if you take the NHL players out of it and you make it a World Junior format, which they're trying to do at the Olympics, that's pretty much the only chance that anybody else seems to have right now.
And speaking of other teams that had a chance, Team USA thought they had a chance coming into this and kind of put all their eggs in one basket as we're going to build this team to stop Team Canada. And how poorly did they design this team? Obviously, not having a guy like Austin Matthews on your team hurts. He would have been a great addition, as we saw.
Johnny Gaudreau as well.
Yeah, Johnny Gaudreau as well. But would they have made that much of a difference when you even have a guy like Dustin Byfuglien sitting out for the first game against Team Europe and you get smacked?
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty bizarre. I think a lot of the things that Torts did were pretty, I don't want to say out of left field, because he's always kind of been on that weird guy range where he makes some questionable choices, but I really think that they were just ill-prepared to come up and face the Canadians because they just got manhandled that game that they played.
But how surprising was it that they went 0-3? I mean, to come in and if you lose to Canada, okay, that's fine. You still maybe finish at 2-1, but you lose to Europe and then you get slapped by Canada, and then the last game doesn't even matter because you're already out of it at that point. I mean, how embarrassing is it for the Americans to come in and just put up a dud and finish last in the entire tournament?
It's terrible, especially because they were on a very good, solid foundation where people thought that they could maybe even give the Canadians a run for their money at the next Olympics, even the last Olympics. You know, we've seen strong performances from the Americans recently in international hockey. There's a ton of guys in the NHL who are lighting it up as Americans. Like we just spoke about, Byfuglien, Johnny Gaudreau. We have Austin Matthews now. You have guys like Ryan Kessler. You have players like Dustin Brown, who captain of the Kings, a bunch of Stanley Cups. So you have guys who know how to win and know what they're doing. And I really think it just came down to they did not look like they were prepared, and they did not look like they were as good as the Canadians were, and nobody did. And if you look at the setup of the tournament, The Americans scored 5 goals in 3 games. The only other team that scored less than that was Finland, right? And they're in the group stages, they gave up 11, which was the second most. You know, and you look at a country who has usually a great goaltender. They had Jonathan Quick, you have Ryan Miller, you have all these elite goaltenders, and nobody seemed to be able to stop the puck.
And it's interesting that they built this team as a defensive powerhouse, and they were going to be a grind it out. We're going to win games 2-1, 3-1. I mean, they were scoring enough goals to win games 2-1, 3-1, but they just got overmatched skill-wise, even by Team Europe. So you talk about these young guys that come up, guys like Austin Matthews, and I think the Leafs are very excited right now. We've talked about Marner and Austin Matthews and William Nylander, and how exciting of a time is it to be a Leaf fan? Yeah, they're probably not going to make the playoffs this year. All in all, they're a fun team to watch, but looking down the road, are you excited if you're a Leafs fan right now?
Absolutely. I don't think that there has been a better time to be a Toronto Maple Leafs fan in terms of since I've been alive than probably right now. Because think about it. You have 3 of the top 15, 20 young players in hockey under the age of 20, right?
Yeah.
So with that, you have a good goaltender. You know, I know Anderson hasn't played well to start off the year, but the last few games he's been picking it up a little bit.
Well, Anderson is a legitimate number 1, and that's something they've been missing in the past 6 or 7 years. You had the cycle of Reimer and Jonas Gustafsson and then Jonathan Bernier. And I think with Frederik Anderson, and as much as people are going to rip on the choice to go out and splash and get him, I think he's a bona fide number 1 going forward that you can rely on.
Yeah, 100%. And he's 26 or 27 years old. He's young. He has a 5-year contract ahead of him. You lock up Gardner and Riley to be your young defensemen. You know, there's a lot to look at on this team and think 5 years from now they might be the best team in the NHL.
Is this something that Edmonton should have pulled 5-6 years ago? Because we're starting to see it now with Edmonton once they got rid of Taylor Hall, that they're fully committed to this rebuild. And they should have been committed to that rebuild 7 years ago when they had all these number 1 picks. And they got guys like Taylor Hall, who is a bona fide superstar, playing in a terrible Edmonton team. Yakupov, you can say what you want about him as a number 1 pick and as a bust. But, I mean, now they have all this McDavid, you have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and you have all this young talent that they need to rebuild an entire franchise around. And I feel like Edmonton, even though they are an exciting young team, has kind of set themselves back 5 years by wasting it and not rebuilding defensively enough to justify all these offensive draft picks.
Well, if you look at their young defensemen like Nurse and Clefbaum, and then you have Adam Larson thrown into the mix, they're definitely building in the right direction. To go with the point of Taylor Hall being traded, which I think was a terrible trade, I think that even if you have him in the mix, he makes a bigger impact offensively than Adam Larson will make defensively. And I really think that if you're going to trade a perennial 80-point scorer, you have to get some sort of high-end defenseman back. I mean, you saw P.K. Subban and Shea Weber traded for each other. You're telling me that Edmonton couldn't get one of those guys if they were going to just swap defensemen?
I think the issue with Taylor Hall wasn't so much they were looking to get that top-level defenseman. Taylor Hall was just taking up too much cap room, and they had to get rid of him because if you're going to build your team around McDavid in a few years, he's going to be the one that you're looking to get to spend the money on. And guys like Nugent Hopkins and you mentioned Darnell Nurse, these guys are going to be asking for more money once their rookie contracts and their young contracts are up. And these are guys that I think are more valuable to the team than Taylor Hall would have been just based off of the money. I'm not saying Taylor Hall is not a valuable player, but bang for your buck, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that when you're looking at a team like Edmonton or Toronto or even the Winnipeg Jets to a certain degree, the Winnipeg Jets seem to be the opposite, where they have a strong defense and they have 3 guys who are under the age of 20 playing left wing for them this year. So, again, another team who has that one part of the game on lockdown. You know, they have that great defensive. You know, we just saw Jacob Trouba re-sign. So I really think that the trend in the NHL is slowly going to become, hey, if we can suck for a few years, but we have the right people in place. You saw Edmonton, it took 3 years till Peter Chiarelli came in, right? So you saw Babcock and Shanahan and Lou Lamoriello and all these great Mark Hunter, all these great hockey people come into Toronto, and they said right from the beginning, hey guys, we're not going to be good for like 2 or 3 years. And as a fan base, I think that if you said to a Toronto Maple Leafs fan, 5-6 years ago when Brian Burke was still here, if you said, hey, we're going to get Mike Babcock and Lou Lamoriello and Brandon Shanahan, and they're going to run the organization, and we're going to suck for 2 or 3 years, but we're going to be good for 6 or 7. I think every single fan and every single sport would take that trade if they had those caliber executives coming into their team.
Look at what Pittsburgh did when they got Sidney Crosby. Look at how they rebuilt that with Marc-Andre Fleury, and then they got Jordan Staal, Evgeny Malkin, and it was an interesting article I was reading. An interesting video comparing Connor McDavid and Sidney Crosby after the first, 58 games. And Crosby has 2 more points than Connor McDavid does after his first 58 games. And it was an interesting comparison because that Pittsburgh team, when Crosby first came in, was a lot like this Edmonton team, really rebuilding and resetting, hitting the reset button. And we saw how that paid off in about 4 years when they made it. First, they made it to the Cup and then finally won the Cup in 2009. And we're at an exciting kind of rebuilding time in hockey where we have Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews, and these guys are drawing a lot of comparisons to the Evgeny Malkin, Sidney Crosby's, Alexander Ovechkin. And I think the Crosby-Ovechkin comparison is a really interesting one because you have 2 elite-level guys from different countries playing in different markets for different teams that are going to be going forward the 2 biggest stars in the league and drafted back to back. And is this a valid comparison comparing McDavid as Crosby and Matthews as Ovechkin going forward?
I think that you can definitely make that argument, but it is very, 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 very difficult to make that comparison when they've been in the league. Connor McDavid's played 58 games. Austin Matthews has played 9, 10, 11, 12. Right? So it's very difficult. You can definitely see the parallels, but I also think that if you look at the way that Crosby and Ovechkin play, their style of play clash a lot more than Matthews and McDavid do. Ovechkin is a very, very aggressive player. He gets a lot of hits, gets into the play, a lot of block shots. He'll go into the corners, where you see Sidney Crosby in more of that finesse player role, where he's constantly feeding the puck through him. He's almost like a midfielder in soccer, right? And Ovechkin more of a pure sniper. Now, if you want to get into pure sniper, that's where you get the Steven Stamkoses and the guys like that. But I think as an overall player, it's you can see the comparison, but it's difficult to make that assumption from such a short sample size.
But I mean, people were making that comparison with Lemieux and Gretzky when Ovechkin and Crosby first came into the league, and where Gretzky was that 2-way player, was always going to move the puck around, lots similar to Crosby in game style, and Ovechkin and Lemieux were these big, bruising right-handed shots that powered their way and scored these flashy goals and really made the game exciting. So I don't think it's unjust to make these comparisons, and I think you're right. There are different styles of play compared to Crosby and Ovechkin. But I think as far as star power is concerned, these 2 guys are going to be running the league going forward, and we're going to see, you mentioned Stamkos, Crosby, Ovechkin going into these Jaromir Jagr-like roles as the veteran guy that's still going to put up points, still going to be a star in the league, but the league going forward is going to revolve around McDavid, McKinnon, Matthews, Johnny Gaudreau in Calgary, and even in Winnipeg, maybe Mark Scheifele has started to become a very good player. So I think that it's an exciting time for hockey because we have so much young talent. But speaking of young talent and veteran talent, and we're talking about Washington and Pittsburgh, I think those are your two, I guess, preseason favorites to repeat. Obviously, Pittsburgh repeating this year. And maybe this time is it finally Washington's year to win it all?
I mean, how many years have we said that Washington's going to win this year? Because I know I said it last year. I thought last year there was no chance that they were losing with Braden Holtby and Ovechkin and Kuznetsov and Carlson and Alzner and all those good defensemen, Niskanen in the back end. They had a perfectly built team. And for whatever reason, they just can't seem to get over that hump. And it's funny because a lot of people are very, very critical of these big-time athletes who don't win. Look at Peyton Manning. Look at Sidney Crosby for a majority of his career. He only had one cup until last year, right? So I think if you look at Alexander Ovechkin, he might be the best. Like, personally, I would take him on my team over Sidney Crosby. And so if you're looking at a guy like that caliber, that 1A, 1B player of a generation, it almost seems silly not to assume that he's going to win at least one Stanley Cup.
You brought up taking Ovechkin over Crosby. I wholeheartedly disagree. And here's why I think Washington won't win the cup. Because of, you look at what Pittsburgh has done and built this foundation of a lot of two-way players. Guys like they had Crosby back in the day, Pascal Dupuis back when they won it in 2009, and all these guys that can play on both sides of the ice. And I know Ovechkin's improved his defensive game, but that's the one thing that's going to haunt him throughout his career is he can't play in his own zone. Yeah, he's going to score 50 goals, but if you're going to talk plus minus, penalty killing, a guy that I want on the ice at any given time, I'm going to take Sidney Crosby. I think that Crosby is not only a once-in-a-lifetime talent, but a once-in-a-lifetime player and a guy that, like Jonathan Taves, that I want to build my team around because he's not a liability in the defensive zone. And that's what's plaguing a lot of young guys coming out of junior, coming out of the OHL. And we're going to talk with my dad about this a little later, is adjusting your game to the NHL game. You know, a lot of these guys like Nail Yakupov who come out and they fly around and they're real exciting to watch and they are great in the offensive zone. But if you can't play in your own zone, you can't play in the NHL.
Yeah, 100%. And especially with the way that the game is becoming more systematic and more defensive-based, if you look at the way teams play and the rate that they're scoring goals, you know, everyone is more concerned with having the best goalie in the league rather than the best shooter. You know what I mean? And I know goals are hard to come by, and if you read the article that Jim Rutherford wrote for the Players Tribune, Jim Rutherford, the general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he talks about in his article about Phil Kessel and when they acquired him from Toronto. And in the article, he wrote something along the lines of, you know, it's tough to score goals in this league. And the way that the league is progressing defensively and with all these systems and how good the defensemen are and how well trained these athletes are, not only as hockey players, but as athletes, pure athletes. And I think we're seeing more and more of them pop up in the NHL and guys who can really take that game to the next level and shut your players down. And I think those types of guys are becoming more and more important in hockey.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish.
I was just going to continue. And you also look at guys like, you know, Erik Karlsson or PK Subban, or even Shea Weber, when, you know, maybe not as much the last few years, but in his prime. You see all these offensive defensemen who are very good at jumping up in the rush and who are great skaters, and maybe not Weber as much as the other two, but I still feel that in this style of play, especially with the 3-on-3 in overtime, you can definitely still be a defenseman like Erik Karlsson who scores 75, 80 points a season and still play a key role defensively. You know, what team we watched the first night of the season, or one of the first 2 nights of the season, the Leafs played against Ottawa and they went into overtime, and it was Kyle Turris, Bobby Ryan, and Erik Karlsson, right? That's arguably the best top 10, top 5 best 3-on-3 lineup you can have, right? And I think that with the way everything's progressing, where it's a much faster game and a much speed-based and defensive systematic-based game, that we're going to see less goals, but we're going to see a lot more action.
I'm glad you touched on Shea Weber, because I want to get to Montreal, and there's been this drought since '93, when Montreal last won the Cup, of Canadian teams not winning championships in all sports, except obviously the CFL, because a Canadian team wins it every year. But Montreal has built this kind of foundation, and I mean, we saw what happened when Carey Price wasn't in net and they gave up 10 goals to Columbus. But they're sitting comfortably in their division. I think they're 6 points up on Tampa Bay right now at the time we're recording this, and 1 point up on New York for first in the East. But they've built this kind of foundation of, we're going to be a defensive team, we're going to grind out games, and they're going to win. And I think they were a different team last year when they lost Carey Price. They were a very different team. And I think as much as people are going to dispute the PK Subban Shea Weber trade, I think Shea Weber brings a great now veteran presence and a defensive presence to this Montreal team that might be able to carry them to the next level. I still don't see them. I don't see them as a Stanley Cup winning team, but I think they're a Cup contender, and I think you have to consider them a legitimate threat going forward to come out of the East.
Where do you put teams that kind of sit? Montreal, I'm still not 100% sold. I know they have Radulov and Pacioretty and Galchenyuk. I know they can score goals to a certain extent, but I just don't know if that offense is going to be enough to put enough pucks in the net and not have to rely on Carey Price making 40 saves a night. If you look at the back end, Shea Weber, Andrei Markov, both kind of on the other side of the hill. Andrei Markov probably only has a year or two left in the NHL, and Shea Weber is obviously not the player he once was, now into his 30s. I think if you look at teams like Montreal, Pittsburgh, Washington, the New York Rangers, and the Tampa Bay Lightning, that's probably your 5 teams that you're looking at that early on and before the season and probably later into the season, they're going to be the teams that everyone's picking to make it to the Stanley Cup from the East. And I think that just hitting on the Rangers and Tampa Bay specifically, they're kind of the 2 teams that not a lot of people have really given much credit to. You hear Pittsburgh, Washington, Montreal pretty much every year for the last few years, ever since that Galchenyuk draft. And I can't remember what year that was. Maybe you can look it up. But when we talk about the powerhouses in the Eastern Conference in the NHL, the Rangers are there every year. They have Henrik Lundqvist. They have a very strong defense core, a very solid team. And again, I could almost put them in that Washington range where they almost seem to not be able to seal the deal, right?
So Galchenyuk was drafted 2012 was what Pete was saying there. And I think you're right. I think New York and Tampa Bay are these consistent teams, a lot like what we used to see out of Detroit back in the day, back in the early 2000s and through the 90s when they had Lidstrom and Yzerman. And you could never really count them out as Stanley Cup contenders, and I think that's what we have to accept now with New York. And I like that there's 5 teams, because I got 5 teams in the West that are all legit contenders. You got Chicago, Dallas, St. Louis, Anaheim, San Jose. These are all real Cup contenders, and another one is Los Angeles. You can never count Los Angeles out. But the one surprise right now is how well Edmonton's playing. And we talked about how they've kind of been doing this rebuild, but is it time to accept that this isn't a rebuilding team and we can count them as contenders, or will they be able to keep up this pace right now?
Well, I still think, and part of the knock on the NHL recently, and I guess it's not really a knock, but it's something that the fans have grown to kind of expect, but it's the same teams every year, Chicago, Los Angeles, Anaheim, now Dallas up and coming. I think they're a very, very strong team. And I think that if they had Sagan and Ben down the stretch both healthy, that they might have had a better chance of going further in the playoffs. But when you look at these teams that the NHL are modeling around, it's the same. Again, it goes back to that same basic principle. We're going to be able to have 3 or 4 guys who are absolute studs, and 2 of them are going to be defensemen, and you're going to have to score on us, and our goalie's not going to break in the playoffs, and we're going to grind out 2-1 wins, and we're going to be able to beat you 5-0. And if you look at those teams that you just mentioned, you could even throw the Minnesota Wild in that mix because they've been right there in that division. And I think if you put teams like St. Louis, Minnesota, and Dallas, even the Winnipeg Jets, the way that they're playing the start of the year, I think if they're Eastern Conference teams, that there's a lot, you can really notice the divide between the East and West, right?
So really quick, Pete, I want to get your take. We're about 13, 14 games into the season. Almost a quarter of the way through. Give me your prediction. East, West, we'll just go Stanley Cup. Who do you got? Putting you on the spot here.
If I had to go right now and decide this team's going to play against this team, I would say that it would be the Chicago Blackhawks against the Washington Capitals.
Fair prediction. I'm going to go Dallas Stars for all the points you said about how they could be healthy. And I'm going to go with the Pittsburgh Penguins again, barring Sidney Crosby's health.
I think the toughest thing to do in sports is repeat. And, we've seen with these big dynasty teams, especially with the Blackhawks in hockey, I think that team is very talented in Pittsburgh, but I think with the whole thing going on with the goalies, with Fleury and Murray, and then, Chris Letang and Malkin always seem to find out their way onto the IR at some point over the year. But I think that if you look at the way Washington is built, you have arguably the best goaltender in the league, arguably the best goal-scoring line in the league with Kuznetsov, Ovechkin, and Backstrom, and just a lot of really good veteran pieces. I really think that if Alex Ovechkin doesn't win this year, barring him getting traded later on in his career as kind of a role player, when he gets to the 35, 36 range, I find it very difficult to see him winning as a captain on teams because he's had time and time again where he's had such a good team around him, and even he's performed well in the playoffs, but for whatever reason it just hasn't gone his way.
Let's hope it goes his way soon because it might haunt his legacy, much like Peyton Manning was haunted by that for a while.
One more point quickly about the Dallas Stars. I really like that pick. I think Sagan, Ben, superstars, studs, Jason Spezza, good secondary scoring. The one thing I want to touch on with them and maybe Anaheim and Edmonton, those three teams in the Pacific, or the three teams in the West rather, what do you do with between the pipes? Because all three teams have had major goaltending woes. And really, if you look, is Cam Talbot going to be a sustainable goalie for the Edmonton Oilers? Is a platoon with Kari Lehtinen and Antti Niemi the solution for the Dallas Stars? I mean, if you take one of those, and if you look at, in Anaheim as well with John Gibson, the young goaltender, also American, if you look at those three teams and you give them Corey Crawford, even Corey Crawford's not even played that well, but he still wins in the playoffs, and he's, you can't really question a guy who's won 2 or 3 cups already. But if you take a goaltender, from Carey Price's level, or if one of those teams trades for Ben Bishop because they have Vasilevsky behind him in Tampa Bay, or if one of those teams trades for Jakob Markstrom in Vancouver or Ryan Miller, how different does this become if one of those three teams can get some solid goal? Because we saw Anaheim picked Gibson over Anderson, and then Tampa Bay has the 2 goalies who are both starters and haven't really been able to pick what they're going to do. Pittsburgh has 2 goalies who are NHL caliber starters. And you have Edmonton and Dallas who are these superstar teams but don't really have anything at the back end that's stable.
I like that you brought up Edmonton, and I don't think Edmonton is there yet. I don't think they can keep this pace up, and for the reason that you said, it's their goaltending. Maybe if they trade for a good goaltender, or maybe not even another goaltender, but another high-caliber defenseman to sort of bolster up that back end and give the goaltender some help. But I don't think they're there yet. Dallas, on the other hand, I think Kari Lehtinen, with the superstar team they have, could have a playoff run. And Dallas kind of has to make a commitment to play that two-way game that we talked about Detroit and like the New Jerseys did back in the day. Obviously, they had Brodeur. But a lot of successful teams, and you look at Detroit is the example I want to use. Was Chris Osgood that much better than a guy like Carey Price, or was Chris Osgood the product of a great team that led him to that championship? So speaking of championships, I just noticed on your timeline, you talked about the Chicago Cubs and how you really wanted to be a Chicago Cub. And that brings us to Pete's tweets. We're going to cue the music up here. And I want to start with Pete and his injury report for the morning, as he woke up saying, there is a head-first slide onto a super dry infield sized bruise/cut/painful thingy directly on my hip. Hashtag Pete's tweets. Pete, care to elaborate on that?
If you saw my tweet yesterday, I have these shelves in my hallway at my house, and I was running up the stairs on the phone, not paying attention, absolutely hammered my hip on the side. The shelf fell over, huge dent in the wall, massive bruise/cut/really hurts thingy on my leg.
Sorry, yeah, so Pete then also tweeted, I really just want to be on the Chicago Cubs, hashtag fun, hashtag Pete's tweets. Pretty self-explanatory.
I mean, have you seen all the stuff that these guys have been doing? Like, it's actually incredible. I don't know if you saw the Twitter exchange between Anthony Rizzo and Chris Bryant, but Chris Bryant was going on Jimmy Kimmel, and Rizzo, David Ross, and Dexter Fowler were going on Jimmy Fallon. And basically there was a you're pretty good down 3-1 joke being thrown in there. So a little bit of shots at the Cleveland Indians there too.
So Pete then tweets out, there's a demographic of people like myself who have great hair, and sometimes you have to hide it on bun and sweatpants day. Hashtag Pete's tweets. But Pete, you got the flow going right now.
Yeah, because my hair tie broke when I was on the way to school today. But look, Roots track pants, can't go wrong.
Also leads into the next tweet. Attacking the Day is wearing a Texas A&M Johnny Manziel jersey with Roots sweatpants and Ray-Ban aviators on the trek to school. Hashtag Pete's tweets.
Again, pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty much a power move outfit there.
So I'm sitting in class. I'm just mentioning this. And Pete, did you make it on time for class today?
2 minutes. 2 minutes late.
2 minutes late. Disappointing. But we maybe can blame it on the construction workers because, as Pete says, this city, meaning Toronto, has the worst construction-to-construction worker ratio in the world. Hashtag Pete's tweets.
Holy shit. Okay. I was in Union Station, and they've had the same construction going on, and I literally say this every time I walk by there, and there's one guy working, and everybody else is standing there hacking darts and drinking coffee. So City of Toronto, clean it up.
Oh, it's awesome. So Pete eventually made it to class just on time. Out by half a step walking into class, but we're fine. Best of Pete's tweets. If you want to look it up on Twitter, there are many other tweets. Hashtag Pete's tweets on Twitter at BigPete44.
Yeah, another great week. We're almost getting into interview territory with your dad coming in. We want to touch on a couple things before we talk to your dad. Basically, we want to continue on this trend of talking about, what direction is hockey going into. And again, he played in the 90s and the early 2000s for the bulk of his career. So he'll be able, and now he works as an analyst at the NHL Network and for TSN. So he'll be able to give us a good inclination of if we're right or if we're just full of shit. But, what kind of trends are we looking at? We look at all these defensive metrics and we look at sabermetrics, and not just in hockey but across all sports, and how much they're having an impact with so much information available to all these teams and all these players. And we see last year's playoff ratings were down 61% in Canada. There's no Canadian teams, and none of them are really going to be competitive this year except for maybe Montreal and maybe Winnipeg. So the game is changing a lot, and there's a real coming of age, with all these young superstars and all this fast play and all these meshing together with all these defensive systems and all these sabermetrics on how to stop these guys. So what should we be expecting from the NHL now? Like, what's good?
I think the game is good right now. You talked about guys being faster and stronger, and there's a great article by the Hockey News called NHL players keep getting faster, stronger, and more skilled. How far can hockey evolution go? And there's just been such an increase in the speed of the game and harder slap shots. And you're right, better goaltending and better defense. But I think it's an exciting time for hockey. And there's such a big hot topic with concussions and with fighting in the game, and obviously fights are down, and hopefully concussions can continue to come down. But the game is faster, the game is more skilled, and I think talking about the World Cup of Hockey, Team North America showed what the future of this game is. And I think we're all in agreement that watching Team North America was exciting for hockey. It's exciting for television. And if that's the direction that the game is going, I'm perfectly okay with that.
I think, too, if you look at how teams approach the game now, and you see how all these every team has a big stats guy who, you look at the Leafs, they have Kyle Dubas as their assistant general manager. You look Mark Hunter's sabermetrics, and you saw what they did with the London Knights, and then both of them were hired on to work for the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they were kind of two of the guys who really started this movement and pushed it in hockey. And again, I'm not a very big sabermetrics guy in hockey and in sports where there's no breaks. So I find it difficult to see all these advanced stats at work when the play is constantly moving. If you look at a sport like baseball, where there's a different pitch every time and there's different scenarios set up every time, and they're controlled scenarios where there's likely going to be a 3-1 count this game. There's likely going to be this happen. There's so many different situations that you can pinpoint and look at data for, whereas in hockey it's very difficult to look at things like how effective you are on the ice without the puck, because how are you going to be able to track that with the game moving so fast now? And again, I think that sabermetrics definitely have a role in sports, especially with how much technology and video and replays and things like that are affecting how we watch the game and how we look at the game. But I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the product on the ice. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, can you put the puck in the back of the net and can you keep it out of yours? And the way that the game is looking right now, I think that it's going to be an interesting mix of the both. And I think we'll see a lot of clashing styles with all the good goaltenders and all the good young snipers coming up in the game.
Well, we talk about how the game has transformed, and we kind of got a flashback to that old style game in that Leafs and Canucks game just last week or a few days ago. And can we not say that style of game and that, fighting and the big hits and is that not what the fans want to see? We talked about, the Broad Street Bullies and back in the day with all these incredible big hits and Scott Stevens and the Mike Bossies and these guys, and how big and strong they were and how they weren't afraid to stand up a fight. Wendell Clark, Doug Gilmour, all these famous Leafs. Is the game more exciting then with all these big hits and these fights, or is it more exciting now where we're seeing this kind of decrease and decline in the big hits, and now it's a more fundamentally skill game?
I think that the way the game is now is a lot more beneficial to a young player coming up into the system and young people watching the game. So I think it is better because these are the people who are going to be watching the game for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Whereas you've kind of seen that generation of, you touch my star player, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. That generation's kind of past and gone. Teams don't carry a fourth line full of fighters anymore. You have guys out there. Cal Clutterbuck on the Islanders plays on the fourth line, plays 13 minutes a night, but he plays on the power play unit too, right? They're not looking for these big goons to come out and be enforcers. And we can ask your dad this when he comes in, because I'm sure he played with some very good guys who were there to just fight. But we've seen that role diminish in the NHL, and I think it's for the better, because I would rather have a young 22-year-old kid who's a power play specialist and watch him play for 15 minutes a night or 10 minutes a night than watch some guy come out for 5 shifts and get 20 minutes in penalties.
So Pete and I are both in agreement here that the NHL is better now than it was 20 years ago. But like we do every week, we're going to flip a coin, and one of us is going to have to argue the opposite. So if it's heads, I will argue the NHL is better 20 years ago. If it's tails, you will argue that the NHL was better 20 years ago.
It's heads. You have to argue that it's better.
It's heads. All right, well, like I said, 20 years ago, which is what, 1996 is 20 years ago. That's scary. There were more goals. We've seen a gradual decline in average goals per game. You look in the mid 90s, 93, 92, we're averaging about 3.5 to almost 3.7 goals per game for one team. And now we're almost a goal less per game. We're at 2.7, 2.75-ish goals per game. And the game was more exciting with all these big hits and all these big name players. Think of guys, Joe Sakic and Steve Yzerman and these pure goal scorers. And yeah, we still have pure goal scorers now, but it almost feels like they aren't allowed to show what they can do because the game has become more defensively minded and, like you said, more schematically based. And I think that you look at New Jersey and how they brought in the neutral zone trap. That was so fundamental in changing the game, but it was boring to watch back in the day. People didn't want to see that. They wanted to see this up-tempo, this high pace. And as far as TV ratings are concerned, that would be why I would argue that the game was better 20 years ago. There's more goals. People want to see goals. People want to see hits. People want to see fights. That's what people pay to see. So from a TV rating standpoint, I could argue that the game was better 20 years ago.
But on the other side of the coin, literally and figuratively, when you look at, if we're talking about speed, the game is faster now than it was 20 years ago. These guys are just better athletes. There's more training. There's more technology available to them. You know what I mean? And it's like that across sports. But I think the real thing of what makes the NHL and what makes sports in general right now, I think every league right now in professional sports is on an upswing, including the NHL. Because look at all these young, extremely talented, and extremely personable people that are coming up and representing these sports. Look at baseball right now with the Chicago Cubs, like we just talked about. These guys are everywhere right now. Every single person watching those games was rooting for them to win. You have these 23, 24-year-old guys, Rizzo, Bryant. The whole thing's great. You look at, even in the NFL, which probably is the only league that hasn't really been doing much incline and has been more on a decline, but look at Marquise King, the punter for Oakland, with his dances after that's from the punter. Right? And then in hockey, McDavid, Matthews, they're not really very emotional guys. But if you look at guys like Patrick Kane, who celebrate their goals, right? Ovechkin, right? You have these fun, exciting, energetic things going on in sports right now. And I think hockey is right on the cusp of blowing it up even more, especially when you look at just how incredibly talented these young kids are. At Austin Matthews, 18 years old, 19 years old, right? And there's so much room for them to grow. And I just think that the game is in such a place where it could explode, just like we saw with the NBA recently and how big they've gotten with all these big personalities and easy marketable talent, because everybody's good and everybody's good in front of a camera. And I think that moving forward will be a huge, huge advantage for the NHL with all these young players coming up. Okay, we have to wrap it up. The first portion of the pod. We have Dave coming in after the break. We're going to talk more about this new age versus old school in the NHL. We're going to talk about some of his experiences as a player and as an executive for the Peterborough Petes and also as a broadcaster. And we're going to get into a whole lot of other fun things coming up after the break.
And we're back on the Big and Tall Sports Podcast, joined by our esteemed guest, my father, Dave Reid. Dad, how are you today?
I am good, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So my father was selected in the 1982 National Hockey League entry draft by the Boston Bruins in the third round, 60th overall. And can you just describe for us what that feeling is like, seeing your name pop up and getting drafted?
Well, it's a little different than it is today. The draft was in Montreal. It was a weekday. So I was still in high school. finishing up my grade 13 year while playing junior in Peterborough. And the draft, unless you were a first rounder, you didn't go to the draft. My agent was Bill Waters at the time. Rick Kern worked with Bill and eventually took over the company. And but Rick was my kind of the communication I had through my agent, and they were like, "We don't think you're going to be a first rounder." It was a 21 team league, so we'll let you know. And there were no cell phones, so I had to carry on draft day. There were a few of us in Peterborough who were going to hope to be drafted, so I carried around the old boombox in high school on draft day, and it was middle of the day, and we were in an English class, and we were listening. The updates came every 15 minutes on the local radio station. So the update came that I had been drafted in the third round, and Mike Postovat had been drafted to St. Louis. We were co-captains of the Petes, and we eventually became co-captains of the Petes, and we'd both been drafted around the same time. So that's where I found out. The teacher, I got a little round of applause, the golf clap from my classmates, and the teacher generously gave me the rest of the day off. But this was a weekday, so I had to get home to my billet's place to phone my parents to tell them that I had been drafted, and then I waited for a call from the Bruins and my agent later in the day when the draft ended. They got home, and it wasn't quite as a quick response as it is today, but it was still pretty special to be drafted. I was a huge Leaf fan growing up in Toronto, and Boston was an Original Six team that I knew all about, following Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. And in '82, those guys had left there about 6 years earlier, so they were a very good team, and it was very exciting. And that was in June. Early June, so I knew at that point in September that I'd be getting the opportunity to go to Boston.
You said that you grew up in Toronto, grew up in Etobicoke, Ontario. We visit quite often, see our grandparents up here. What was it like living in Toronto and then eventually getting the chance to play for Toronto? I know you've talked with me about being like a bike courier in Toronto and growing up here. And what is it like playing for the Toronto Maple Leafs after dreaming of playing for them for so long?
Playing for the Leafs was it. It was a dream come true. You watch them on TV on Wednesday nights and Saturday nights, and on the road, you're Daryl Sittler for me, or you're Boreas Salming or Lanny McDonald. You're one of the stars of the team, and then to actually get the opportunity to put the sweater on and have the opportunity to skate on Maple Leaf Gardens in front of the fans is pretty special.
I could imagine. So you bounced around the NHL, played for a few teams, won a couple of cups in '99 and 2001 with Colorado and Dallas. What were some of your memories from those Stanley Cup years? And, you played in the league for so long. What were some of the differences you saw in those teams compared to some of the other teams that you'd played on in Toronto and Boston and other spots?
I think when I got to Dallas in '96, the difference there was, even in Boston for the majority of time that I was there for 9 years, and in between that I was in Toronto. The difference getting to Dallas was the direction the team was going to win a Stanley Cup. Every year in Boston, at the start of camp, Harrison would have the meet and greet, and the first discussion was, we are going to, we're here to win a Stanley Cup. Toronto, the team wasn't as strong. It was a little bit different. Nobody actually said we're here to win a Stanley Cup. But when I got to Dallas, you could see the direction the team was going. I got there in '96. The Stars hadn't made the playoffs the season before, but they had brought in players like Sergei Zubov had come in, Joe Nieuwendyk had come in. They brought myself and Pat Verbeek in that 1 year. And you could see that the direction, the way the team was channeling to win a cup. Ken Hitchcock had come in as coach halfway through the year. And just the whole process to get there, the direction was, we're going to win. And even though that was it in Boston, there was still a budget that the team had, not a salary cap, but a team self-set budget that if you needed that extra player or that little extra, you weren't necessarily going to get it because of the budget that the team kept itself on. A lot of teams do it, but in Dallas, there really was no budget. We had an owner that came in and put the money down and was like, let's go, let's do this thing. So that was the difference I saw when we got there in '99. And it was very similar in Colorado. When I got to Colorado, the direction was they had won it in '96, and the direction there was we need to win this again. And every year there was a big trade to bring someone in at the deadline to kind of get us over the hump, or someone in the summer for the 2 years that I was there in Denver. So I think those were the differences that we were very close when I got there, even though they didn't make the playoffs in Dallas in '96. And by the time I left there in '99, we had 2 President's Trophies. We had a Stanley Cup, and my first year in Dallas, we missed the President's Trophy by a few points. And then Colorado was the same. We were President's Trophy and a Stanley Cup in 2 years there. So the direction was to be the best and win, and at whatever cost. And that, at whatever cost, I think was the biggest difference.
So you mentioned whether it be bringing guys in the off season or bringing guys in during season. You played just under 1,000 games with all sorts of Hall of Famers, all-stars. Who are some of the guys that you played with and against that you would maybe say are either sneaky, that guys don't get enough credit for being too good, or guys are overrated? Who are some of your favorite guys you played with and against?
That's a great question, because you only hear the players who are in the Hall, and I played my last 5 years with many guys who are now in the Hall of Fame and just moved into the Hall of Fame in the last few years, were selected to the Hall. So Sergei Zubov is one player who I think should be in the Hall of Fame, who would be in that category of playing with. Was one of the best that, for me, he was very underrated defenseman. He dominated the game. When he was on the ice, he had ice running through his veins. There was really no pressure on him at any time. He would get the big goals for us. He would make the great defensive plays. Not a big guy, probably about 5'11". He might have been 180 pounds, but he was very shifty, a right shot defenseman. He also won a cup in New York, and I think he and Brian Leetch were the team leaders in scoring, and that was in his rookie year when they won the cup. So he was a player that I really believe, in a lot of people who played with him, I think everybody who played with him feels that he should be in the Hall, and he's not. Another player who I played with is Guy Carbonneau, who I played against Guy and I played with Guy in Dallas, and very underrated. Selke Trophy winner, defensive forward, but probably one of the best face-off men I've ever played with. Fantastic leader. Off the ice, very calming influence. Had a very... he was a captain in Montreal. He didn't wear a letter with us in Dallas, but his influence as far as his leadership from the young guys, from the Darian Hatchers to Mike Modanos, even Joe Nieuwendyk was still pretty young when he was with us in Dallas. The leadership that he brought to the team with Guy Carbonneau, I'd say those two guys I played with, and I played against them when they were in New York for Zuby and Montreal for Guy, are two players who I think are probably a little underrated, and I think both of them belong in the Hall of Fame.
So we're chatting with Dave Reid, my dad, who currently still holds a Maple Leaf record for most shorthanded goals in a season with 8, tied with Dave Keon. And you were able to really adjust your game coming out of Peterborough and adjust it to that defensive style, shorthanded style. And that's something that Pete and I talked about in the first half of the podcast, about how a lot of these guys in today's NHL are struggling defensively and adjusting their game to the speed of the NHL game. Is there a certain formula that you had, or any way that you were able to adjust to make a successful career out of being that shorthanded, being that defensive-minded player that you were?
Good question with that, Alec. And interestingly, I think it's more of a mindset and a survival mindset in my situation. When I was in junior, I was offensive player, but in Peterborough they taught you the defensive part of the game, the whole game. Everybody calls it a 200-foot game. I got to Boston, that was the same. Responsibilities were expected in your own zone as well as in the offensive zone. And when I got to Boston, I was actually, I think I scored on like 6 of my first 7 shots. I got called up in January. Wilf Paymont gave Charlie Simmer, who was a left winger, same position I played, a stick to the chin, broke his jaw, and all of a sudden the team needed a top left winger. So they moved me up very quickly to play with Butch Goring and Rick Middleton on the top offensive line on the team. And everything I touched went in the net. So all of a sudden, I'm this big scoring left winger. And this was I played half a year in Hershey, and now I'm in the NHL. It's I think I had 14 goals in 38 games or something like that. My first year, 36 games. And I was on the point in the power play with Ray Bork at times. So, hey, this is easy. The game's easy. So my game was offensive. Unfortunately, for the next 3 years, I thought I was an offensive player, and I ended up and down in the minors in the American Hockey League more than with Boston. And when I got to Toronto, my complete game was still there, but the Leafs had very little structure. So I played in a line with Vince Damphousse and Daniel Marois, who were offensive guys who would pretty much get the puck and go. And I realized that if I wanted to stay or play on this team, that I had to get the puck out of my own zone. And we kind of clicked early. We played about 6 weeks together and at the start of the year. And that's kind of where my defensive responsibilities started to take place. And I realized that I can stay with the Leafs if I, kill penalties, block shots, do the little things, get the puck out. And that's where my transition of my game, I say that the thinking part of the game was I realized if I'm going to stay for survival aspect, I want to stay in the NHL, I'm not a goal scorer. I have to make sure that I'm the guy who does all the little things that you don't see on the stat sheet, but your teammates appreciate. And really from there, for really the next 13 years, that was my role. My responsibility was killing penalties, shutting down offensive players and other teams. I was always a good skater. It was probably my best attribute was my ability to skate and keep up with everybody. And when you kill penalties and shut down, you have to be able to skate and you have to understand the game. And I think I had a fairly good mind for that. And that was survival. If I didn't do it, and I kept thinking I was an offensive player, I was out. And in today's game, it's difficult because most players who come in the league, this game is a much more worldly game than when I played. There weren't as many European players in the game, and it was still predominantly probably about 80% Canadian. And now the game has gone around the world, and everybody coming in is highly talented, and skill set is off the charts. So when you get to the NHL, it's because of your skill set. And to stay in the NHL, it's because you have to have a mindset as to where you fit in a role on a team. For me, it took me 4 years of bouncing around in the minors a little bit in the Bruin organization. And I came to a weaker team that appreciated what I was doing. So for a lot of these players, I played with a lot of players who had more skill than I ever did, who played a very short time in the National Hockey League and were never seen or heard from again, so to speak. But that's what today's game is. Every player coming in has got tremendous skill. And if they want to stay, they have to make that conscious adjustment to say, I'm going to be a checker, a skater, and I'm going to make sure that this team keeps me in the National Hockey League.
Do you think that transition from skill player in junior, which, like you just said, a lot of guys who come into the NHL are skill players when they come in, do you think that transition was easier for you to make when you played, or in today's NHL where it's a lot of systematic play, the game is very fast, there's not a lot of fighters, so there's, do you think that transition is was easier for you to make as a player, or do you think it's easier for these guys coming in now?
I think it's easier now. And it's an interesting question, Pete, because a lot of times people don't look at it in that regard as to why it would be easier or if it's even easier. And the reason I say it's easier is I really think the players today, the systems that are played in junior and even in minor hockey are very similar to what you play in the pro game. And each team is a very, very similar system. So no matter where you play or what part of the world you play in, most teams do some sort of a 1-2-2, clog up the neutral zone, trap type of game. And most of the breakouts are short passes, short puck support up the middle and out. And it's all about speed through the neutral zone and attacking with speed. So no matter where you played, the players are all playing a very similar style, and they've all got that high-end speed. And when I came in, everybody had a different role. You had guys who were the fighters. You had guys, you had one or two lines. If you had 2 lines of speed, you were a good team. If you had 3 lines of speed, you were a great team in the 80s. And in today's game, everybody can skate. Everybody has got the speed. So the transition of keeping your skill game is there, but it's still, for the players who want to stick around, really have to adjust their mindset. And you have to have the skill, because if you can't skate and pass in today's game, you're not going to be able to play. Whereas when I played, we had a lot of guys you didn't want to play with in practice or a defenseman you didn't want on the ice with you because you knew the puck was going to be in your feet or off the glass up around your ears. So or you'd be picking up gloves as a teammate, because that's what you're out here for, is just to pick up their gloves after a fight. And the game, that part of the game has disappeared. So most players you see today have got that high-end skill.
How much better do you think the state of the game is now? Well, you've talked about less fighting and a lot more speed. We're also seeing a lot less goals. There's been a very steady decline in the number of goals since the early 90s. Do you think that, how much better do you think the game is now than it was, say 20 years ago, when we had this kind of parallel between, you said, different roles? So we had fighters and we had goal scorers and we had checkers.
That is a very, I guess, a volatile question. And saying not enough goals is something that, we could go on, and you could have another 2 or 3 podcasts as to why you don't have enough goals in the NHL. My main thing, I'll start with that one. My main thing is the goaltender's equipment is still much larger than it should be as far as protecting rather than, blocking the net. Goaltenders are much more athletic. I remember when I came in the league in the 80s, the goalies would, they were the worst conditioned athletes, and they were, but they just stopped the puck, and their equipment wasn't as big, but the shots weren't as accurate. So I think that the systems, the second thing to do with the shutting down of less goals is the systems the teams play, and the fact that everybody can skate. You could match up in the 80s a first line against a third or fourth line, and you knew that team wasn't getting out of their zone, the team that had their third or fourth line on. And that is that's something you don't see as much anymore. Most teams don't have a line that is that weak that can get caught up in their own zone. And I think just the fact that the speed of the game and the entertainment value of the game, if you're looking at it, you're asking what, do I think the game is better now than it was then? Or I think the entertainment of the game is completely different. Back in the 70s and 80s, hockey was known as a physical sport. People would go there they'd want their big hits, they'd want their fights, they'd want their almost their brawls at times, and that was all part of the National Hockey League, and that was part of the entertainment that people, we were a sport that you could fight in, and that was regular to drop the gloves and protect your teammates. And the entertainment has changed in the game of hockey. The entertainment of the game now is all about the speed and the skill and the wow factor of the players playing. And even though the goals are down, they've kind of stabilized over probably the last 5 or 6 years. You're going to get 5 goals a game pretty much every game. The skill and the ability to make plays is still, I think, at an extremely high level, and that's the entertainment value of today's game. And I think growing the understanding of concussions and injuries, and realizing that we can't have our athletes pounding on each other like we'd had in the past. That's changed the game. I think today's game is much more entertaining to watch. If I'm watching a game from the past to today's game, you still see the skill in certain players, but the entertainment value of watching a game for today is, in my mind, the game's at a better place today than it's ever been.
You just spoke about how the game has changed throughout eras, and that was a common thing that we talked about in the first part of the podcast. We also spent a lot of time talking about these young superstar players that we're seeing all across the NHL, a lot of them being guys like Connor McDavid, Aaron Ekblad, Mark Scheifele in Winnipeg, Johnny Gaudreau, Austin Matthews with the Leafs. We see sort of the changing of the guard from, you still have your Sidney Crosbys and your Alex Ovechkins of the league, and you have guys like Stamkos and Joe Pavelski. Where do you see these young players taking this game forward, and when do you think that you'll see that full change of the guard from the Sidney Crosbys and the Ovechkins to the Austin Matthews and the Connor McDavids?
I think now, Pete, is a time, probably in a year or two, you're going to start seeing the Pavelskis and the Thorntons and the older guys stepping on. I think Crosby and Ovechkin probably have 5 years of top hockey, top speed left in their game. And I would say 4 or 5 years is when the Austin Matthews, the Gaudreaus, the Connor McDavids and Jack Eichels of the world are really going to be the poster players, so to speak, of the game. I don't think the game, I've said it for years, I don't think the game get faster, but it does. It may get a little faster, but I think you've got 4 or 5 years of the older stars left in the game today that will still be stars of the game at that time. But it won't take long when these young guys are soon passing them.
We talked about a little bit, not so much comparing Matthews and McDavid to Crosby and Ovechkin, but more comparing in general these three eras, I guess, of stars with Lemieux and Gretzky. And how well do you think that these stars are comparable from Gretzky and Lemieux to Crosby and Ovechkin, and then all the way down to McDavid and Matthews?
I think the comparisons with each other are similar, as in with each other as far as pairs, like Lemieux, Gretzky. If you wanted to get into Howe and Richard and Lemieux, Gretzky, and Crosby, Ovechkin, and now you've got McDavid and Matthews is the next pairing. I think those pairings are all comparable. I don't think you can compare eras to eras. It's just not fair. The game has changed. The athletes have changed, but within each pairing, I think the comparisons are very similar. You've got top players of the game who, when they're going to go head to head, are going to put on a show, because that's what stars do when they go head to head. And these are the players who carried the game for different eras. And I think it's very obvious that it's going to be a McDavid Matthews for the next 5 to 10 years. And it will be the same as Lemieux and Gretzky. We're not talking 200-point years, but we're talking, East and West conferences, different styles of play in both conference, and it's always been that way. And you're looking at players driving the game, and players forcing players, or forcing the game to the next level. So I think the comparisons are great within each other, but not necessarily within the eras.
I want to quickly talk about a guy who has went through, I guess now, almost 3 eras that we've been talking about, and that's Jaromir Jagr. And eventually everyone seems to have to retire at some point. Eventually somebody will slow down. Why do you think he just hasn't slowed down?
That is a something that, physiology is probably more the answer to that than necessarily what he's doing on the ice. He has changed his game to adapt. He's not the same player as he was, but he's still got the speed and he's got the strength. His training regime is very, very different than most players. He's got the keys to the rink for every team he's played for. He'll go in and work out at 10, 11 o'clock at night on his own. And that's something that has, I think, allowed his body to continue to go where it goes. He was always, I remember this, I've never played with the Armor, but I always hear the stories. It's like, well, if I've just skated for an hour on the ice in practice, I don't need to ride the bike for half an hour or 20 minutes after. I've left everything on the ice. So he would come in later in the day after he's refueled and come back in. And he's done this for years. He would come back in later and do a workout at night, because he is allowing his body to recuperate. And then when his body's rested and fueled, he'd come back in. And most players don't train that way. And most players, I could never imagine going back to the rink at 9 or 10 at night to do an hour on the bike or do an hour of exercise. But he's done that. And I think certain people have certain genes that allow you to play sports or be physically fit. Why do people live to 110 and other people live to 70? Everybody's different, and Jaromir Jagr's one of those people whose body is just allows him to continue to play at a high level and doesn't wear down like the average person. And as part of his workout routine, it's as much maintenance, keeping himself in great shape as it is to stay in the league. So combination of those is the reason I see why Jaromir Jagr is still playing.
You just touched on how Jaromir Jagr was able to stay in the league with the way he carries himself in the weight room as well as on the ice. Do you see that the way that players train today and the way that they prepare for games, whether it be game day in the off season, during season, I know now they have mandatory rest days in the NHL. How has that compared to when you played and how players were, on a regular schedule if you were playing a game?
I think, well, I know in today's game the players are much more in tune to what's going in their body and what they need to go in their body. When I started, I was still in that era where in '82, my first camps, where players were getting in shape coming into camp. That's completely changed. And I would probably say in the late '80s that had completely changed, where you were in top shape coming into camp. But today's game, because of the way the game has gone worldwide and the amount of people who are playing the game, you have to get the edge. So to get the edge, it's probably been, I'd say, 15 to 20 years where players are really realizing that what I'm putting in my body, what I'm eating on a day-to-day basis, is probably more important than the workouts that I'm doing. And that's, to me, is the biggest change, is just the players are treating their bodies more like machines as far as nutrition in, and what the nutrition is going to allow them to put out on the ice in their workouts. And specific hockey training is another thing. Specific sport training is another thing to get power in certain areas of your body. I remember when I retired in '01, the last few years I played with Peter Forsberg. Well, Peter, you looked at him and, from the waist up, you wouldn't think he could, break an egg, because he wasn't a big guy, but from his waist down to his ankles, his power came from his legs. And more players start to realize, Paul Kariya was probably one that really got the ball rolling. I don't need to lift weights and be strong. I need to be powerful in my sport. And that was the European kind of motto of power from the legs. And in North America, it was, no, you've got to be, you've got to come in with big muscles and strength top to bottom. And that's changed in the last 20 years, where now the sport is very sport specific. Training is all one leg training. You only skate on one leg throughout the whole game. Your power comes from one leg drives. Your shot is core strength. You don't need to have, I think, players round their body out to be in good physical shape, but it's not the same upper body and power strength upper body as it used to be. And that, I think, is one of the biggest differences is the way that players are training in sport-specific exercises.
So you mentioned when you retired in 2001 after winning the Stanley Cup with Colorado. Retirement is kind of the inevitable for any athlete. At some point, you have to call it quits. I know Brett Favre did it 3 times. But is that a scary thought once you're done hockey? And obviously you had a very successful career, 18 years in the NHL. What is the mindset when you retire, and did you have a plan once you were retired as to what you were going to do?
No, I had no plan. I really expected your mother to go to work and I might take some time off, but that didn't quite work. Interestingly enough, that when my wife and I, your mother, Kathy, she graduated university when we got married and I was starting my career. So the plan was, when I was done, that Kathy would go back and teach school and then I would finish my education. Well, my career lasted much longer than anticipated, and we were able to, by doing that, we'd kind of gone past the window of getting, Kathy back into work. So when I retired, I was hoping to get back for one more year. I was 60 or 39 games away from 1,000. So I was really hoping to get that. And but I had also scored one goal on my last, 70-something regular season, and probably my last 80 to 90 games in my final year. I'd scored, and it was a dump in from center ice, and I think it was on Nanny Legacy that I went to change. I didn't even see it go in the net, but I think you might have been there for that one. So I knew I was going to retire when I'd get up in the morning and I would have trouble putting my shoes on and my skates on, and it would take me, and the extra hour to get to the rink earlier to make sure that I had heated my whole body up that I could play. So I knew that the end was very near, but the plans to move on were not really sure. I had fully anticipated staying in the game in some sort of coaching capacity. And then when we moved back home from Colorado, 2 young children, you and your sister were still in grade school, and we felt as a family that it was the best decision was for me to find something local. And I was very fortunate that I was able to get on with TSN. TSN had just picked up the NHL rights package in '01. In November, they had signed a 5-year deal. I worked with the NHL Network, which had which just started in 2001. So I was very fortunate. My timing was great. If I'd come in a year later, that may not have, the opportunity may not have been there, and those spots might have been filled. But I really wasn't too scared or too worried about it because I'd won a cup and in 01 in late June, and I really thought I was going to go back and play in the fall, not knowing where. And with winning the cup, it didn't really matter what was going on. Life was good, and even at the time I was 37, didn't realize I was going to have a long life ahead of me. But like I said, I was very fortunate that the television and getting involved in the media was an opportunity for me. I was always the spokesman for the team when we lost in the playoffs. It's like, hey, Reader, you're up. When you won, you talk to Joe or Peter or Mike Madonna or Joe Nieuwendyk. And so I had a pretty good experience of talking to the media and knowing the people in the media, and I think the combination worked well in retirement.
Do you think that now in the media, you've been doing it for so long, almost as long as you played, is it different? Do you look at the game differently as a member of the media compared to when you did as a player? Like, I don't know how extensive video was when you played, but now it's a big part of all sports, not just hockey. So how does that play into your day-to-day as a media member, and how did it play into your life as when you were in your career?
Well, the video part of the game wasn't quite as easy as it back then. As it is now. Video was a huge part of the game. We saw video on all teams. We had a video coach who, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, he'd sit in a room and he would bring in the feeds. They probably still do this, bring in all the feeds from all the games. And then the computer systems were just coming out where you could break the whole game down into offensive, defensive parts of it. So as a player, and there's the coaches, they did all the work and put it together for you. It being in the media, I love the fact that if you want to watch a highlight on Twitter, it's right there. Hey, let's talk this. And even when you're on air, you've got your phone right there, and you can quickly look at a play that, if there's 10 games on at night and we're NHL on the fly and we're or NHL Tonight, and you're talking about something, you can quickly look down, have a view, close up of the play, which you couldn't do 5 or 6 years ago. So media-wise, the game has come so far, and I think it's all a good thing, because you can reach out to people who want to see the game and just want to see highlights, and you can see it at any time or when you want to watch it on demand, so to speak. If you only want to see certain things, you can just pop in on your device and watch at that time. So media-wise, for the video aspect of it, I think it's fantastic. But we were all pretty good when I retired. It was getting there, and the programs the teams have now, you'll see coaches look down in a game to watch the highlight. Every bench has got that, and I think that is a great tool for the game. Not only part of a coaching tool, good or bad, but it's so up to date, and with the speed of social media and the speed of what we can do. And I think the NHL is, much like all the other sports, they're right on the forefront of it.
So you just touched on the video boards on the bench and stuff like that being introduced to the game. More and more technology is being implemented in sports. So if you were running the NHL, if you were Gary Bettman for a day, what would be some of the changes that you would make, seeing as we're making a lot of big changes, especially technologically?
Wow. If I was Gary Bettman for a day, let's see. My first thing would be to get the goaltender's equipment in check. These things aren't easy because you have a players' association, which I was a member of for years and represented my teams for years. And I know it's not that easy to always get everybody on the same page, but that's one thing that I would push for. I would really push for the television, especially in the U.S., to make sure we are highlighting the best young superstars of the game. And that's something that, for ratings-wise, Connor McDavid in Edmonton and Austin Matthews in Toronto and even Johnny Gaudreau in Calgary, you're not getting to see enough of these, superstar young players in the States. And that's where a largest part of our audience is. And that, to me, would be something that if I was Gary Bettman for a day, I would be pushing the television through the States with NBC to say, all right, guys, we need to show these young guys and we need to show them regularly. And the problem is you don't get ratings in the States when the games from the Canadian teams people don't want to watch, or, you don't grab the extra ratings from two teams. You only get ratings from one team. So I understand the economics of it, but that's something that I would really be pushing. It's let's push these young guys all over North America.
One last thought. What do you think about Vegas coming into the league next year, and how does that impact both the players and the teams? I know I wasn't alive the last time they did an expansion, but what's that process like, and what should we be expecting from a new team coming in Las Vegas?
I think it's great. I think expansion anywhere is fantastic. I know everybody in Canada wanted them to get into Quebec. Logistically and financially, it wasn't there. They were still short one team in the West after Vegas comes in. I think Las Vegas is going to be a very competitive team. This is going to be the best expansion available for any team because of the players that are going to be available, and there's so many strong players out there, and the rules that teams can only protect minimal amount of players. Each team can only lose one player, but you can only protect minimal amount of defensemen or forwards, and I think that's fantastic. There are a lot of quality players who are going to be left available, and some players will be left available because of their contract, and the teams are looking to reduce some salary, which a lot of good players will be available. So I think George McPhee in Vegas is going to do, the general manager of Las Vegas is going to have lots of good players to draft from, and I think they're going to be a competitive team stepping in. I don't see them in the playoffs for a few years, but I think they should challenge, and they'll probably have one of the best records from expansion teams just because of the players that are going to be made available. I think going to Vegas is pretty neat. I think it's a fantastic entertainment city, obviously the top in the world that people want to go to for a quick weekend of entertainment, and I hope hockey is part of that entertainment that people are going to want to watch.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up on that. I know you and I could sit here and we could talk hockey all day, but thank you so much for joining us today, Dad. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, that's going to do it for the Big and Tall Sports Podcast. Tune in next week when we talk concussions with my friend Dan McDonald. Thanks for joining us.